Hello, my name is Alexandra Vercrew. I'm the Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and it's my enormous pleasure once again to be having a book talk with Professor Serhii Plokhii from the History Department and Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute. Serhii has written, by my counts, this is your 14th book, is that correct?
Maybe.
You've lost track. Serhii is an incredibly prolific and wonderful author, and we're here today to talk about his latest book, which focuses on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's an interesting topic. It's one that has been discussed and written about for a long time, and one of the best known characterizations of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that the United States and the Soviet Union were eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy blinked. But the way you describe the book, in fact, the fog of deception, mutual suspicion, unreliable and outdated information made it so that we could barely see the other guy, let alone see his eyeballs, right? And so much has been written about the Cuban Missile Crisis. You would think that by now, like, we would have known exactly what the other side looked like. They might even be completely undressed. And yet this book is here and provide some new information on the crisis. What were you trying to do with this book? What's new here?
Well, first of all, thanks for this wonderful introduction. And I'm certainly happy to be back on the platform provided by the Davis Center. And again, answering your questions and having this discussion. So thank you. In terms of why another goddamn book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, well, maybe we have enough of those. Well, there is a lot of things that have been written. And when I was looking at the literature on the crisis, and I was interested in the crisis for a number of reasons, including some personal. I lived on the street in Dnipropetrovsk where every single ballistic missile that was delivered to Cuba was built. So there was this interest. And there was an enormous amount of literature. And I was started, of course, with the Robert Kennedy's 13 Days. It was going from there. And eventually I got lost. And then I went to something that I normally do. I went to the primary sources, and I started with the Kennedy tapes. And what I saw there was actually very different from what I read in most of the books that I consulted, and in particular in Robert Kennedy's book, 13 Days. So what I saw there was a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of miscommunication. And that's not the dominant narrative that at least exists in our literature. It's very much being shaped by 13 Days. It's about the young but wise president, and he was young, and occasionally he was wise. But there were a lot of mistakes and missteps on both sides, and that's what I'm trying to bring you in terms of interpretation. Another new thing that is there is the degree to which I'm relying on the memoirs coming from the Soviet side. Again, they're not entirely new, but certainly they're not part of the mainstream either of the Russian or /Soviet writing on the crisis or the American one. And those are supplemented by the recently released or declassified KGB documents that I probably was the first historian to consult, and maybe still is the only person who worked with those. They come from the former KGB, now State Security of Ukraine archive in Kiev. And those are reports of the KGB officers that accompanied every single ship that was going from the Soviet Union to Cuba and back, and roughly maybe 80% of those went through the Ukrainian ports, so Crimea and Odessa and Mykolaiv and so on and so forth, and they're now in Kiev. So from that point of view, I got access to this view from below that only KGB reporting could provide, and again, that was something really interesting on a number of levels. I'll be happy to talk about that in more detail. But that's what is new. First, new is maybe my really dissatisfaction with the literature that is there, and presentation of a new take on the crisis as a march of folly, really. I wanted to use that title from Barbara Tuchman's book, but it was already taken. So I went instead for nuclear folly, but it's clearly a nod toward her book.
Actually, that's one of the things that's so interesting is the references to Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, right, are everywhere in the book. Obviously, John F. Kennedy had just read it. He was extremely disturbed by this idea of sleepwalking into World War I by miscalculation and not understanding the other side, and kind of getting caught up in events. And yet, in so many ways, they seem to be making the same mistakes.
Exactly. That is unbelievable, because the impression is that Kennedy was actually waking up and going to bed with this idea of misunderstanding, miscalculation. He was talking about that to Khrushchev when they met in Vienna, roughly a year and a half before the crisis in 1961. And Khrushchev was really unhappy. He didn't want to talk about misunderstandings and miscalculations. He was pushing the world revolution and was trying to redress the disbalance in nuclear weapons. But for Kennedy, it was a big idea and a big theme. But it's amazing to what degree they couldn't really read rightly the signals that they were sending to each other. Kennedy, it never occurred to him why Khrushchev decided to put the nuclear missiles on Cuba when during one of the discussions, one of the aides to Kennedy tells him that, well, but we have missiles in Turkey. It's next door to the Soviet Union. And Kennedy completely just disregarded that and said, no, those were different times. And he meant that those were times of Eisenhower and also the times when the US didn't have enough ballistic missiles, not any kind, but long range ballistic missiles. But that was exactly the situation in which Khrushchev was in 1962. Khrushchev never was able to figure out, of course, like it was the case with Stalin and with every Soviet leader, what the American democracy was about. That yes, you can bully unexperienced American president and try to get from him this and that American president can be even scared at some point and be prepared to give you what you want. But there are advisors, there is his own Democratic Party, there are Republicans who are critical of him, and so on and so forth, because Kennedy, quite often it is said that Khrushchev misjudged Kennedy. I don't think he misjudged Kennedy. Kennedy was caught on tape saying that in the middle of the crisis, saying that, well, agreeing with McNamara and with others that the Soviet missiles on Cuba didn't change the balance. It wasn't really a major threat to the US. But he said that, well, last week when we were asked what we were going to do about that, I was supposed to say, I don't care. And they said, no, we'll respond. So now we have to respond. So Khrushchev, who was making decisions on his own with very little advice coming from anybody, couldn't imagine the circumstance in which Kennedy worked and functioned and what democracy was about. So this is just a couple of examples of really not being able to understand the other side, where the other side was coming from. And on the top of that, of course, there were, it was taken more than one day for a letter from Khrushchev to arrive in the White House. It's just, you read that, you return, you go back to the sources, you read again, maybe didn't understand something. No, that how much time it was needed to convey a message. And you started with this metaphor of the other guy blinking. Yes, the other the guy indeed blinked, but they didn't know that it happened.
Right. They didn't notice for 24 hours, right?
Right.
Turned around. Yeah.
Kennedy was still agonizing whether to give an order to attack the Soviet ships, and those ships actually turned back 24 hours before that he was trying to make that decision. So again, just one of the examples that again we were dealing with a very different world in terms of the information technologies. And it seems to me I end one of the chapters saying that the nuclear age arrived before information age, and the chances were that the whole thing could turn into Stone Age because of that.
Right. You know, one of the things that that was interesting to me is that the idea that Kennedy couldn't understand Khrushchev was in part because maybe because he was making these very individualistic decisions, but the people who could have conveyed his mindset, such as Dobrynin, the ambassador in the US, either they had no idea what was going on, or their mission was to kind of paper over what's happening and not actually to explain what's happening, right? And you see over and over, Robert Kennedy is trying to meet with some of the Russians in Washington to figure out what's going on, and he's just unable to get any kind of clarity from those meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. And the main reason was that Dobrynin was the last guy to learn about what was going on in Kremlin. So he was getting first some communications on public radio, Moscow, then specific instructions going to him. And that just shows you the way how really Khrushchev operated and was able to get away with that. So there was little advice, and then once the decision was made, there was little really effort put to designing the way how you deal with that, how you communicate with the US. So his own ambassador was not informed about what was going on. And then he spent no time at all conveying what was going on to Castro. Mm-hmm. Kennedy is agonizing for days and days how to sell the idea of removing American missiles from Turkey to the NATO allies in Europe, and still can't figure out how to do that. And Khrushchev didn't spend just 1 second on thinking how he would tell Castro what was going on. The assumption was that he was a junior member of the Communist Club, that he would fall in line, that he would literally almost follow the orders coming from Moscow. And Castro refused, causing then a major new crisis in that whole story, the crisis that is very much overlooked. Again, it's known to experts, especially working on the Soviet side of the history through Mikoyan, but it's not part of the American narrative. American narrative is still very much defined by 13 days, written by Robert Kennedy, when in fact there were 13 days, but the entire crisis was going for more than 1 month. And was resolved only in November 20th, 1962, partially because Castro just refused to go alone and wanted to grab the Soviet tactical weapons that were on the island and that the US knew nothing about.
It's interesting also from the very beginning, though, that the Soviets make this plan to put these nuclear weapons in Cuba and don't talk to Castro about it until very late in the game, right? They've already decided they're going to do it, and then someone decides they should check with Castro to make sure it's okay, right? And even while articulating the whole anti-imperialist, anti-colonial language, they take a decision and then they practically send out the ships before they check with the Cubans.
Yes, it's exactly that what happened. And the person who was sent to convince Castro to take the missiles, and again, it wasn't on the part of Castro, it wasn't the decision that he just made on the spot. He said, okay, I'll have to go and to talk to my comrades. So the name of that person who was doing this, the sale job, was Marshal Biruzov. And he was just recently appointed in charge of the Soviet missile forces. And he was prepared to do whatever Khrushchev wanted him to do. So he was successful salesman in terms of convincing Castro to take the weapons, but then he gave Khrushchev what Khrushchev wanted him to tell him, that there was no way of, that there was very easy, there was no problem of hiding the missiles, which were more than 20 meters long, under the palm trees, which I don't know, are 5 meter tall, 7 meter tall. I don't know how tall they are.
And practically naked, as they point out.
Right. But he went back to Moscow and told Khrushchev that no, that there was no problem with that. To dismay of Mikoyan, who knew that was not true. Mikoyan was the only member of Politburo, allegedly a decision-making body, who actually visited Cuba. Mm-hmm. and knew what the landscape looked like.
The role of Mikoyan in Khrushchev's inner circle is really, he's very much out of step with the yes men that are surrounding Khrushchev here, right? From the beginning, I mean, he might not be called dovish, but he was definitely much more skeptical of the entire Cuban adventure than everyone else. Do you think that we've learned something new about the decision-making around Khrushchev or in the presidium here, that there was the capacity for significant dissent, or is it the opposite, that in fact it shows you could dissent, but you would be overruled anyway, it didn't matter?
For me, that was really a very interesting experience looking at that. Again, I assumed that in the early part of Khrushchev's tenure, of course, he had a lot of issues and problems with Molotov in particular, with the old guard that he inherited from Stalin. So I knew that there were tensions. I knew that it wasn't easy. His secret speech at the 20th Party Congress, that was also part of his struggle for power within the Politburo. But after 1957, I assumed that he had really full control over Politburo. And on a certain level, this is true, but as you said, there was at least one person who was not afraid to voice his opinion, and the opinion that was not coinciding with Khrushchev's. Everyone else was actually silent. Mm-hmm. Else, and the Minister of Defense, Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, he was fully playing on Khrushchev's side. So the irony of all of that was that Mikoyan was the only member of the presidium who didn't betray Khrushchev 2 years later in 1964. Right. But all of these guys who were silent, then at the meeting of the Central Committee, we were of course attacking Khrushchev for a lot of things, but including his really adventurism with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And another thing that I was thinking about was, I couldn't help but think about that, a comparison with the American and the Soviet systems, when in the American system, these members of the ExCom, Executive Committee, they really serve at the pleasure of the president. Mm-hmm. They're really aides. But the level of degree, the degree of the disagreement, the level of the discussion, so they could just tell, probably not indefinitely, but certainly more than once to the president that they didn't agree with him, that they would have to look for the tactics, they would have to look for the words, but clearly there were real discussions and real debates where Kennedy would find himself more than once on losing side. In Soviet case, none of those people are technically aides. Right, they're all elected by the Central Committee. They all have political careers and trajectories of their own. But the system is designed in the way that for them saying no to Khrushchev was really politically almost impossible. So only Mikoyan, who was more senior than Khrushchev in terms of his services at the highest level of the party and the state, could afford to do that, and even then to a degree. So the difference couldn't be more striking between between the decision making in the White House and the decision process in the in Kremlin.
One of the first kind of profound looks at how decision making was different on the American side and on the Russian side was Graham Allison's book, Essence of a Decision, right, which looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis and tried to explain it from the point of view of three different models. So one model was the rational actor. These countries and their leaders are acting rationally and doing what they can to protect their interests. The second model is one of bureaucratic politics, right? That each institution has its own interests and is advancing them, and that's what constrains the choices. And the third one is, I think, what he calls governmental processes or government politics, which is basically that the leader is dependent on his entourage, both for information and in terms of providing the representatives of stakeholders that keep him elected or keep him in position. And obviously Khrushchev and Kennedy come from very different positions, right? They have different bases of support, they're different political systems, but in the way that you describe the situation, it comes down to kind of the great man theory, right, of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that it all comes down to Khrushchev and Kennedy, their desire to avoid nuclear war at all costs, and their sort of fear in the moment of what could happen, that disaster is avoided because of them. Is that an accurate way? Is that describing where you come down?
Well, it is, and again, Graham Allison wrote a wonderful book, and it's amazing how many things he got right, because the book was written before the Kennedy tapes were really became available, and certainly he didn't know what was going on the Soviet side. All this information came much later. Again, they revised the book with Philip Zelikow, but once the Kennedy tapes became available, but again, they were pretty much working very much in the dark on many things. But again, it's an excellent book. I certainly benefited from it. In terms of Khrushchev, yes, absolutely, it's a great man making policy. He was in control to a degree that. I don't know, maybe Stalin was at some point already late in his tenure, maybe late 30s. There was just one dissident voice, and again, Khrushchev got his way. There were some maybe changes in the way how they dealt with the issue, but basically it was Khrushchev's vision, Khrushchev's idea, and Khrushchev's responsibility at the end. Mm-hmm. With Kennedy, again, it's a little bit more complex because, again, he was not in the situations where he was not overruled, but outvoted by the members of his executive committee. He would go along with them. And an issue and either response to Khrushchev or the public statement that would be in line with whatever the consensus was around the table. But then what he was doing when he couldn't get his line through was that he would have a small ExCom, and he would invite only people whom he liked, or whose position he liked. The case with sending Bobby Kennedy to Dobrynin and saying to Khrushchev, okay, we are prepared to give up the missiles in Turkey, when the majority of the ExCom didn't want to do that. And we also know that if that mission to Dobrynin would turn out to be not effective, there was another plan that was ready, going to the United Nations and actually asking the General Secretary of the United Nations to propose this swap of the missiles. Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, Kennedy was getting his way, and the ExCom served not really as a decision-making body, but as an advisory body to the president.
One thing that I noticed in your discussions of the ExCom, the American ExCom, is that the Americans were obsessed with Berlin, right? For them, Cuba was actually all about Berlin, right? And the two were inextricably linked to the point where I think National Security Advisor Bundy was worried that, like, if we do a blockade of Cuba, then we'll have a blockade in Berlin. And for the Americans, these two issues are really very tightly linked. Was that also the true on the Soviet side, or was it again a question of miscalculation?
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid it is another question of misunderstanding and miscalculation and lack of the good intelligence. What we have is that Khrushchev really believed that the Berlin question was solved with the building of the wall. So for him, that was even the most dramatic moment that we all talk about, one of the most dangerous, allegedly, moments in the history of the Cold War, with episode at Checkpoint Charlie. Mm-hmm. For Khrushchev, that wasn't a big event. He already decided that, again, there was the wall. He was not allowed to be pushed by Ulbricht, by the leader of East Germany, to do anything else. And an agreement was reached. Again, it was a backdoor agreement using Soviet military intelligence guy, Colonel Bolshakov, who was one of the back channels also during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But Khrushchev was he kept using the Berlin card to intimidate Kennedy, and Kennedy believed that that was real, that was for true, that another flare-up, another major crisis was coming in Berlin before the end of 1962. So it wasn't just Bundy, it was him as well. And one of the chapters of my book, the title is Hostage of Berlin. So through most of the crisis, Berlin was the key factor on Kennedy's agenda and his thinking, part of his thinking. That's why he was actually much more hawkish during the first week of the crisis than we believe he is, because again, his brother did an excellent job portraying him as a wise and dovish and so on and so forth. Well, he was hawkish during the first week of the crisis because he was advocating the idea that there should be surgical strike against the Soviet missiles on Cuba, against McNamara, against everyone else. And the reason why one of the reasons why he was pushing for that solution was that he believed that once the blockade was introduced, another step that Khrushchev would respond with blockade of West Berlin. Mm-hmm. And then he envisioned a nuclear war over Europe, not nuclear war in the Sargasso Sea or mm-hmm. in the Caribbean. So again, it's another case of how Khrushchev was playing the Berlin card, and really Kennedy believed that was for real. Now, the interesting thing is that the Soviets fell victims of their own deception as well. We know now from the records of how Mikoyan was explaining what was going on to Castro, who was really upset, by the way, how things were going. And that was happening in November of 1962. Khrushchev himself believed that Kennedy could not be serious about Berlin, that Kennedy was playing Berlin card against Khrushchev. So this is just one more layer of confusion and misunderstanding. And again, I really wrote that book with the idea that, okay, probably that kind of misunderstandings and misperceptions and mistakes and miscommunications is something that is true probably not only about the Cuban Missile Crisis, something that probably doesn't belong only to 1962 or only to the Cold War, but probably that's that's the situation that we have today as well, in some cases at least.
Mm-hmm. Just following up on the question of Europe and the relationship of Europe to the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of our questions here asks the extent to which both sides, the Americans and the Soviets, kept their allies in NATO and the Warsaw Pact in the loop of what was going on. Were they involved in any way, or was it really just the two superpowers in dialogue?
Well, it was mostly two superpowers in dialogue, and the Soviets really acted. Khrushchev in particular didn't spend much time thinking about informing either Castro or the East European allies. Kennedy spent a lot of time doing that, but at the end of the day, the question was, how do we sell that to them?
Mm-hmm.
How do we sell our position to them? Because the expectation was that Europeans would never understand the American reaction. Europeans would think that would be overreaction to the Soviet missiles on Cuba. Mm-hmm. Kennedy knows that, his advisors know that, they openly discuss that. Europeans were living next door to the Soviet Union, to the Soviet missiles for years and years in and out. And that was part of their Cold War experience. So why Americans would get paranoid about a couple of missiles on Cuba, that was beyond European allies' understanding. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, there was Turks who agreed to take the American ballistic nuclear-tipped missiles, Jupiters, for whom it was a major issue of prestige, belonging to NATO, major issue of security, and so on and so forth. So at the end, Kennedy never told either Europeans or Turks or anybody else that he was withdrawing missiles from Turkey. So it was part of the secret deal. So he never got enough courage to go there and to tell them what was going on.
You dropped a teaser at the very beginning of our conversation about the unexpected things you saw in the KGB archives that you got in Ukraine. So I have one question that's asking here what the role of the KGB was in the crisis and whether the communications that you reviewed gave you any idea of how the Soviets might have better understood Kennedy than we expected. I personally was very interested to see the low morale of the 40,000 Soviet troops that were kept basically underwater for this terrible crossing of the Atlantic. But what is it that you discovered in those KGB archives that we didn't know before?
Yes, well, the book by Forsenko and Naftali that appeared 20 years ago was really a breakthrough in terms of opening to us some key issues about the decision-making process in Kremlin and KGB reporting. Mm-hmm. And what emerges from there is actually that KGB was not a major player. Mm-hmm. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had Dobrynin in Washington, and he was directly talking to Bobby Kennedy. Mm-hmm. Military intelligence had its communication with the White House, and the KGB had nothing. The KGB was also very, very low in terms of what was keeping low profile in Khrushchev's government. He put there the former Komsomol leaders in charge of KGB. So his main question was actually to cut KGB in terms of the numbers, in terms of their influence. So KGB was really a secondary player in that story compared to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, compared to the military intelligence. But what KGB was really good at is reporting about what was happening around them. That's the kind of sources that I got to. So this view from below, at the morale and attitudes of the Soviet contingent, and the belief of some of, well, protests of some of them saying that, okay, I didn't swear allegiance to Castro, why I'm going there. The major concern that the term of their service would be extended beyond 3 years. By the way, yesterday I got an email from one of the readers of the book, or actually viewers of one of my presentations about the book, who was saying that that was also the main concern of him and his friends who were in the National Guard. that their term of service would be concerned. So that is one part of the story. But most important in terms of contribution of those sources to our understanding of the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, one is it helps to explain what I think was probably the major intelligence failure of the entire Cuban Missile Crisis, or maybe the major intelligence failure since or till the Iraq War. The fact that the Soviets were able to bring to Cuba 43,000 people, not 10,000 as it was assumed. The ballistic missiles were not located on the island until it was too late, and until the end of the Cold War, the U.S. never learned about the tactical missiles that they were, or nuclear weapons that they were there. So the KGB reporting explains to us how the Soviets actually were able to hide all those people, as you said, keeping the twin decks underwater, almost suffocating. And prepared that people would die on the ship from appendicitis or something like that, but not allowing them to go to the hospital in the Mediterranean. The irony of that particular case, thank God the guy survived, but the irony was that he didn't know where the ship was going. No one on the ship knew where he was going, but the KGB and others, they were ready to keep him on the ship. If he dies, but no information would go. So that is the intelligence failure on the part of the US, and KGB documents help us to explain how it happened. And another major contributing factor is the understanding of the level of humiliation that the Soviet military experienced as the result of withdrawal from Cuba. Not withdrawal per se, but the fact that they were ordered to show to the American airplanes and ships and so on, to open their twin decks, to show their missiles, to show what they had there. And the Minister of Defense, Rodion Malinovsky, who was closest possible ally to Khrushchev during the crisis, once Khrushchev was removed and he had to explain to his commanders how he, Minister of Defense, became the part of the plot against the commander-in-chief. His explanation was that never in history, either the Russian army or the Soviet army actually went through that kind of humiliation. And that statement was somewhere out there. I don't think anyone paying too much attention to that. But what I learned from the KGB files really helped me to understand that it wasn't an excuse, that he was basically talking to those commanders to something that they deeply felt really, really humiliated and offended by the way how it was done.
So
and
on the one,
that contributed, of course, to a degree. I don't want to overstate my case, but that contributed to ouster of Khrushchev in 1964.
So on the one hand, there's an incredible failure of intelligence from the United States. They don't notice 40,000 people getting put in Cuba. They don't know that there are the tactical nuclear weapons there. And then on the other hand, you have Gary Wills, who writes that Kennedy behaved recklessly. Now, the argument is that Kennedy behaved recklessly on the basis of the information that he had available. But in fact, the information was much worse than what he had available. And perhaps the argument then is that it wasn't at all reckless to be very firm in this situation, even though it created this crisis. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yes, I'm afraid I have an opinion. Basically, one thing that I want to bring up as part of this recklessness or not is the Bay of Pigs situation. And On the one hand, I don't think that there will be a Cuban Missile Crisis without Bay of Pigs, because the message that Khrushchev received was that he was dealing with a young, inexperienced, and very weak president whom he can push around and who would swallow the missiles in Cuba. And certainly that was one factor. Another one was that the Bay of Pigs situation spoiled relationship between Kennedy and the military commanders to a degree that it was almost impossible to repair. So there was a mistrust between the two groups, and that mistrust played a positive role during the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Kennedy was not prepared to follow Chief's advice after what happened at the Bay of Pigs. Again, it's a big question who was to be blamed there, but they were pointing fingers at each other. And what that meant, that the idea of the invasion of Cuba, that was the most dangerous of the possible scenarios, was supported by Bobby Kennedy. He was the hawkish of them all, of all members of the executive committee, but opposed by his brother, the president. And McNamara, when he learned that there were 43,000 troops, that there were tactical nuclear weapons, said that, well, if there was an invasion, the chances of the nuclear war, global nuclear war happening would be, in his opinion, at 99%. So again, recklessness of Kennedy during the first week when he was advocating the strike, you can call it recklessness, but also it's the issue of lack of the information and intelligence. Kennedy joins the blockade or the quarantine group of his advisors once he gets intelligence information that the missiles are probably, Soviet missiles are probably ready to fire. So he changes his position. He goes for blockade. Again, for him, the biggest risk is blockade of West Berlin, but he realizes that it's less of a risk than attacking the launch pads and the missiles on the island.
So, Serhii, your last book was on Chernobyl, right? This book is on the Cuban Missile Crisis. I know you're teaching a class on the international history of the nuclear age, and that you're very concerned with the fact that the United States and Russia is gradually dismantling all of the arms control treaties that were put in place since the days of the Soviet Union. And so I feel comfortable asking you questions about the current relevance of the Cuban Missile Crisis to contemporary affairs, and our audience does as well, I have to warn you. So we have two questions, right? One is whether Ukraine today is potentially for Russia what Cuba was for the United States in 1962. It's one question. And the second one is whether you can draw lessons from your crisis, as we're calling it, to give us insights or ideas about how to avert the impending US-China confrontation over Taiwan.
Okay, thank you. On the first question, I think it's an excellent parallel. I never thought about that in those terms, in a sense that there is this belief in that for Russia, or at least in Russia, that Ukraine is so close geographically and otherwise as Cuba was for the United States. I think it's a good parallel. The difference would be that, as far as I know, there are no plans to put American ballistic missiles in Ukraine, and this is a big difference. Despite dismantling, of course, of the Cold War era agreements, despite the fact that all of those agreements are gone by now. 2019 was the year, August of 2019, when the last agreement signed by Gorbachev and Reagan was gone. So we are in the middle of the new nuclear arms race, or maybe not in the middle, but certainly at the beginning. And from that point of view, I think what I write about Cuban Missile Crisis has relevance not only to the history of the Cold War, but what is happening today. Yeah, there are parallels between Ukraine and Cuba, but there are also significant differences, and I think that we should keep that in mind. In terms of the U.S.-China relations, I have no recipes on Taiwan, but I can tell you that something that I really was surprised to learn when I was writing conclusions to the book and was trying to look for whether there are any lessons that are applicable today. I was surprised to learn that now 30 or maybe more years after the end of the Cold War, the nuclear world didn't change much. We still have two nuclear superpowers, and they're still the United States and they're Russia, and another is Russia. So France and UK and China are more or less where they were maybe at the end of the Cold War, in the sense that they're second-tier nuclear powers. It seems to me roughly around 300 nuclear warheads for each of those countries. So they're really in a different group, in a different class, and it's very difficult to get them get involved and engaged in the agreement to control nuclear weapons or to reduce nuclear weapons, where there are these two heavyweights, Russia and the United States. So that means that some other ways have to be looked at how to handle nuclear China, which is different, and probably the format would be different from this format of relations, nuclear relations, in particular between the United States and Russia. Now, in terms of things that are not nuclear, it is interesting, and we can't see that in the 1960s, but we see that certainly in the 70s, and then during the signing between Nixon and Brezhnev, the first SALT I agreement, that nuclear politics and the geopolitics sometimes actually can be quite autonomous from each other. And what we heard a few months ago, that despite very tense relations between the United States and Russia, Biden and Putin agreed to prolongate for another 5 years the New START agreement. This is one of the examples that the nuclear politics can be not completely independent, but can be quite autonomous from the rest of the politics. And I think that autonomy should be certainly kept in the case of American-Chinese politics. So I was here really on a thin ice.
All right, let me pull you to shore with a different question.
Okay,
Because
okay.
one of the things that you point out as being very different from the situation in the 1960s is that, nuclear weapons have become a bit banal. Right? We're not really afraid of nuclear war the same way people were in the 60s. Mutually assured destruction is kind of out of fashion. So the one thing that comes through that you're quite thankful for from both Kennedy and Khrushchev is that they're both terrified of nuclear war, right? And even though there are tactical nuclear weapons, like the thought of actually using them in conflict is almost unconscionable. And that seems not so much to be the case now, if I'm reading what you were saying towards the end of the book correctly.
Okay, well, thanks, Alexandra, for pulling me to the shore, which happened to be fair. Yes, I'm a strong believer in fear as not just a negative thing that forces you to act irrationally. There is a lot of that, but also something that can be put to good use. And that was the only explanation that I was able to find, and the only answer to the question of why, despite of all these missteps, despite of all these misunderstandings, recklessness on the both sides, but mostly on the Khrushchev side, why we're still around today, why the nuclear war didn't happen. And the answer was that there was one thing that Khrushchev and Kennedy shared. That one thing was fear of the nuclear war. And that is, people are not born with that sense of fear. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev belong to the generation that lived through Hiroshima and Nagasaki, through Castle Bravo test of the first hydrogen bomb, which went wrong, with Tsar bomb, the biggest hydrogen bomb ever tried in the world history. It was all there. So that sense of fear was with them, and at the end, I think that what saved the world back in 1962. Now, if you look at the exchange between some of the American leaders and North Korean leaders in the last few years, you ask yourself a question whether that understanding of how dangerous the nuclear weapons are is still part of the thinking of today's political elites 30 years after the war. And I leave this question with a question mark. Again, I don't know the answer, but what I know for sure that certainly this is not part of the public discourse that it should be. The world is in some form of nuclear arms race, at least since the year 2002, when the US abandoned the anti-ballistic treaty signed by Brezhnev and Nixon back in 1972. And now that certainly arms race is intensifying. The word that is used is modernization of the weapons, which probably modernization is sending a signal that this is a good thing. They will be more modern, more secure, and so on and so forth. But it's also other word for rearmament. So we are there. And I don't think that there is much of a discussion of that beyond the circle of really experts in the field. And that means that the public as a whole doesn't have this degree of a healthy fear, if I can use that term, that again, nuclear weapons are still with us. There are still two nuclear superpowers in the world. The plans are made for the use tactical nuclear weapons in the limited war. Again, I leave that to the experts to decide whether this is a reasonable supposition that there can be a local nuclear exchange in nuclear war. As a historian, I know that the American president who had a lot of experience with warfare, General Eisenhower, didn't believe that there is such thing as a limited nuclear war, nuclear exchange, because he believed that once you're in the battle, you just throw everything you got to get where you want to be or to save yourself. So again, I again end this with a question mark. It's leaving that really to experts to discuss that and to decide on that. But one thing that I am absolutely sure that we all, not experts in today's development of the nuclear weapons, historians or medical doctors, or whoever we are, or bus drivers, we should think about that more, because the world is already in the middle of the new arms race.
Well, that perversely might be one of the positive impacts of the Cuban Missile Crisis, is that it raised awareness of how close we could come in the period of a couple of weeks to an actual exchange of nuclear weapons. And I remember when for the Davis Center's anniversary a couple of years ago, we did a big visualization of channels of communication between the United States and the Soviet Union and the United States and Russia. And what we notice is that after a good crisis, like a big crisis, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, you have a gradual increase in channels of communication and in dialogue, because suddenly everyone has kind of come to the precipice and looked over and realizes that we don't actually want to come close to that precipice. So I hope that it doesn't take a very big precipice in order to get us back to that healthy fear that you're talking about and to increase dialogue, because surely, despite the fact that Biden and Putin are prolonging new start, there's shrinking channels of communication between the United States and Russia, at least since 2012.
Yeah. Well, from that perspective, the Cuban Missile Crisis was, if one can use that term, a perfect crisis, because what you get there is really the back channel became permanent. And another thing is that it scared enough both leaders that the first arms control agreement, the partial test ban, was signed by Khrushchev and Kennedy in 1963, and that was the beginning. Then a non-proliferation treaty in 68, and SALT I and SALT II in the 1970s. So it really gave a major impulse to this process of establishing some degree of trust and establishing the degree of control over nuclear weapons. And again, I really hope that we will not need another crisis of that proportion really to return back to the negotiation table, because one thing that is different today from how things were in the good old days of the Cold War is that there are no rules, right? So we are really in pre-Cuban Missile Crisis situation with uncontrolled arms race. There are very few agreements that are still in place, that are left, and you don't know what to expect from the other side. That is the most dangerous situation. There are also more drivers on the nuclear highway. We are in a situation where the number of the nuclear states is quite limited. 9. Kennedy was afraid that by the end of 1960s there would be at least 20. But if you count the countries that basically have nuclear capability and can turn it into a bomb within a few short months, maybe a year or two, there are 40, right? And that presents a very different kind of a challenge today compared to what the situation was during the Cold War. Again, still 2 nuclear superpowers, but much more countries that are nuclear or can become nuclear.
So we're both in the business of education and hopefully educating experts on Russia, Ukraine, and all sorts of countries. Do you think that the dangers posed by all of these extra drivers on the nuclear road are at all mitigated by the fact that we now have at least more access to information, to travel, to exchanges with people from these other countries than we did in the 1960s? It doesn't take 24 hours now to send a note from the Kremlin to the White House.
Absolutely no. The improvement of IT technologies, this is something that potentially is very helpful. But the rise of cyber warfare is a very dangerous sign that, again, the things can be communicated very fast, but not the kind of things that come from the place that you believe are coming. So now it's again, we are not even talking about seconds. We are talking about a shorter period of time that communication can take place. But there is miscommunication, the potential of miscommunication also arising as well. So there are good things, there are bad things coming with that. And in terms of people traveling here and there, I think this is a very important factor, as long as the countries that are there are democracies, right? Because that means that contacts on the personal level, on the human level with others can also be somehow communicated to the decision makers. If the countries are not democratic or increasingly authoritarian, and so on and so forth, again, the ability of this personal contacts on the not governmental level to influence the position of the government is diminished. But it doesn't mean that actually we should keep trying, because that's as citizens, as people who are not maybe directly making those decisions or influencing those decisions. That's our only channel that we have to influence the governments.
Serhii, I'm so grateful that you keep writing books and we keep having this opportunity for this personal contact, maybe not in person, but at least virtually, and that you give us a lot to think about, although we never talked about hedgehogs. So I highly recommend that everyone read the book because hedgehogs make a very important appearance several times in the book. Thank you very much, Serhii. Thank you to our audience members. And
well, thank you, Alexandra. It was a pleasure. And yes, I certainly encourage everyone to buy the book and read about hedgehogs. That's something that maybe is the most interesting part of the story.